Alright, this screencast is going to begin with the Red Scare. So, kind of just recognizing the graphics on the screen, you see the flag of the Soviet Union, the flag of China, the flag of North Korea. All of these things are contributing to the Red Scare in the United States, which was the fear that communism could potentially spread to the United States. There were several things fueling this fear. First of all, there was, by the end of World War II, a communist party in the United States that had just under 100,000 members. Those members are American, of course. So there was a party that had just under 100,000 Americans who were supporting communism. Granted, that's not illegal, but still making people fear the loyalty of those individuals of the party. Secondly, the government had discovered that there were three in fact, government employees that had stolen classified information and passed it on to a pro-communist magazine. And thirdly, we did have proof that there were, in fact, spies in the United States passing secret information, specifically secret information about the atomic bomb, to the Soviet Union. Excuse me. And we will learn this because the Soviets will be able to construct their own atomic bomb a little too soon than we thought they would be able to. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So this is where we get to McCarthyism and how it relates to the Red Scare. So you've all probably learned a little bit about McCarthyism by this point as kind of the communist witch hunt that takes place in the U.S. under the direction of the man pictured, who is Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. He makes a mess of things. He basically starts making wild accusations across the United States, accusing people both outside and inside of the U.S. government of actually being communists. And he wants to root out all traces of communism in the U.S., but there's just not a lot of basis or evidence supporting his accusations. He kind of makes these really brash claims, again, not having a lot of evidence to back it up, which makes eventually people start to doubt him. Initially, they love him because they're all afraid, and he's kind of feeding their fears with these wild thoughts that they're buying into. But he just doesn't really have a good grasp of things. He gives a speech, for one example, he gives a speech where he's talking about how many communists he has knowledge of in the State Department, and that number would change. He would say, like, 205 one day, 85 one day, 57 another day. So he's just not saying, the same information. People eventually kind of start realizing he's probably just targeting this fear to gain notoriety and eventually gain re-election and maybe eventually a presidential run. So he's just kind of taking advantage of people's concerns, and eventually they call his bluff on that. Where he kind of goes wrong is he accuses the entire U.S. Army of being communist, and that's going to lead to obviously serious investigation, which turns out no factual evidence. And then McCarthy will die several years, really just like 3 to 5 years after the peak in the Red Scare in the United States, after suffering from alcoholism. And all of these things just kind of disprove him along the way. But for a while there, people were very emotional and interested in what McCarthy had to say, and he was feeding off of those emotions. A little communist graphic for you with the cat, a little joke if you want to look at that. Now, eventually, people are going to start accusing President Truman, of being soft on communism, because initially he doesn't do anything about it. But he will decide to create 2 organizations to address the communist problem in the United States, or the potential quote-unquote communist problem in the United States. And that's the Loyalty Review Board, as well as the House of Un-American Activities Committee. So with the Loyalty Review Board, this allowed the government to investigate government employees and dismiss those who were proven not loyal to the United States. Hugh ACK, okay, it's the acronym for the second one, is very similar. Hugh ACK investigates disloyalty both inside and outside of government. So kind of looking at a deeper look at citizens and civilians who were associated with communism and seen as potential threats. We're going to see an investigation of the movie industry conducted by Hugh ACK. Okay, now why investigate movies in this kind of 1940s, 1950s era? Well, during World War II, we were producing a lot of like pro-Soviet films on purpose, kind of to convince Americans to like the Soviets, since we were allies with them in the war, and we're kind of trying to get people to buy into us supporting Stalin. Of course, now all those are looked at as communist propaganda, because it's China. Now it's viewed as, well, you're trying to get us to like the enemy or sympathize with the enemy. So basically, Hugh ACK wants to rid Hollywood of all communist influence, and they're going to have a huge investigation where they bring forward actors, producers, writers, etc., to basically testify in court whether or not there were communist ideas promoted within these Hollywood films, and to kind of work to identify those who were involved. And what happens are you get a group of these Hollywood actors, producers, and writers who refuse to cooperate with Hugh ACK because it's kind of, they're basically kind of calling it bogus and unnecessary for them to have to be answering all these questions when they're just, running a business. And because they're uncooperative with Hugh ACK, they are deemed, quote-unquote, unfriendly. They are called the Hollywood 10. It was 10 specific witnesses who refused to cooperate with the investigation. They're actually sent to prison. And other people who refused to cooperate would be blacklisted, meaning they wouldn't be hired because they were seen as potentially being communist sympathizers or potentially having ties with communist countries. So it's kind of interesting to see like the Hollywood and film industry kind of get put through the ringer in this Red Scare process. One more kind of important response, the McCarran Act. So naming after someone in the UN and a senator, so don't worry about the names. But basically, it was a 1952 immigration law that discriminated against potential immigrants from communist-dominated regions, such as Asia and Southern and Central and Eastern Europe. These areas where have like strong or high communist numbers. They are just convinced that most disloyal Americans are those who have immigrated from these parts of the world that have large communist numbers, and so it starts kind of putting more immigration caps on groups coming from specific countries. Now we're going to talk about two examples of spies in the United States, and two that were ended up being caught and convicted. First, we have Alger Hiss on the left. He was accused of passing classified information to the Soviet Union, but too much time had passed between his alleged crime and his trial date, so he couldn't be charged with espionage because, if you've heard of this term, the statute of limitations had run out. So they had to come up with a different crime to charge him with officially, and they chose perjury, which is lying under oath. And he was convicted and sent to prison. He did claim his innocence the whole time, but pretty much the Soviet Union later, as it was kind of collapsing in the 90s, proved that he was associated with the Soviets and was probably leaking information to them, so proving his guilt. Not that he wasn't still around anyway, but just kind of showing the government had it right in accusing him. The Rosenbergs are a much more interesting story. Julius and Ethel are their names. And I referenced this already, but essentially, by the late 40s, the Soviet Union had made a successful and operational atomic bomb. And they tested it successfully, and this was just much sooner than the United States was suspecting them of being able to produce such a weapon. So speculation comes up that there was information leaked to the Soviets about our own bomb. And Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are those who were targeted. They were members of the Communist Party in the U.S., and they were kind of known to be communist sympathizers, so they get charged and accused of leaking the information. And they claimed their innocence, but when they were questioned about it on the stand during their trial, they both pleaded the Fifth. And you know that when you plead the Fifth Amendment, it means you don't want to self-incriminate. You don't want to throw yourself under the bus, basically, of committing a crime. So it kind of indirectly incriminates them. And despite the true lack of evidence, they are convicted and are actually given the death penalty, which makes them the first civilians ever executed for espionage, which is really interesting. Espionage, by the way, I've mentioned it twice now. That's just a fancy word for spying, and it's spelled Espionage. All right, I'm switching PowerPoints real quick because there's one other thing I want to talk about today. The Cold War during the Eisenhower administration. So this is going to be kind of during Eisenhower's presidency. We'll talk about the Truman re-election in chapter 24 when we look at the Cold War at home in a little more detail and the culture there. But I want to talk about the 50s in this chapter. So we'll talk about Eisenhower's administration. So the arms race is the part of the Cold War where we are trying to compete with weapons and the military between us and the Soviet Union. Okay, we just want to have superior weapons compared to them. There are three parts to this struggle in this arms race: the growth of nuclear arsenals, Brinksmanship, which we'll define in class Monday or today, but then the third thing, and then the space race. So the growth of nuclear arsenals, which is like nuclear weapons, Brinksmanship, and the space race. Okay, so after discovering that the Soviets had a working atomic bomb, we decide we want to build a bigger bomb, and we start doing research and experimentation on the construction of a hydrogen bomb, the H-bomb, which would be basically nearly 100 times, 60 times specifically, more powerful than the atomic bomb. And we successfully tested one on Bikini Island, the Bikini Atoll, kind of in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Just testing it out. Many scientists disagreed with creating such a large weapon of mass destruction, especially after we saw how destructive the A-bomb was. But by the early 1950s, the U.S. did have a working atomic bomb. A working H-bomb, hydrogen bomb. Here's some pictures. That mushroom cloud. Okay. ICBM, an important term, and I do want you to know what this acronym actually means and stands for written out. Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. These are missiles that could travel at greater distances than previous weapons and could hit a pinpointed target with great accuracy. Basically, far-traveling missile can have an exact target, a more exact target location. And the Soviets are who were actually able to create this quickly. They announced that they have a working ICBM by the late 1950s. Notice how we're not afraid to rub in when we construct one of these weapons, because it's more so just wanting to threaten the Soviets or them threatening us that we have a working this, so we're making it very public. And that leads us to the second part of this arms race, Brinksmanship, which is a term given by Eisenhower's new Secretary of State, John Dulles, as spelled on the screen. Brinkmanship means risking war to protect national interest. Risking war. So think about it this way, going to the brink of war. So what that means here is that the U.S. will produce large numbers of nuclear weapons. So will the Soviets. And we are going to basically be convinced that the Soviets are targeting us, So we start building shelters, having air raids, and that's going to reference a video we watch tomorrow.